You know, it is interesting because in some ways, the post-war order, and I think we can talk about it in two stages. There's the post-World War II, post-1945 order, and then there's the post-Cold War order, which was kind of a second helping of that sort of policy. That in many ways, those eras have fulfilled the promises that people spoke of. That when you look at reduction in global poverty levels, the numbers of people who have exited from absolute poverty all over the world in the last 25 years, it's an astounding number. And there has never been in the recorded history of the human race, that kind of increase in prosperity for the poorest. Up until quite recently, you could say that it was also the steady trend toward death in combat, death in war had continued, that there were fewer refugees than ever before, but obviously the last few years we've seen that change in a pretty distressing and dramatic way. So on the one hand, you have this paradox. You have an order which has done maybe not everything that its backers hopes, but nothing ever works out that way, but has actually succeeded in ways that few orders have. And yet it does seem to be facing this kind of backlash. I think one of the elements is the disintermediation of politics. That if you think about American political parties, they are really quite weak. There's a Republican identity and a Democratic identity, but there's not if there were a strong Republican Party system, there would not be a President Donald Trump. The Democratic Party structures are also quite weak and challenged. And if you looked back 2 generations ago, party bosses and governors pretty much picked nominees. I'm not sure that we've improved on that system. But there's also a sense that in a world, people seem to want in this disintermediated world, they relate more easily to a person than to an institution. So a Putin in Russia, the bureaucrat, they hate the bureaucrats, they hate the politicians, but there's Putin. The same with Erdogan in Turkey. Even I think in China, you've seen Xi since the death of Mao, it's hard to see a Chinese leader who has accrued the kind of power and developed the kind of public image that Xi has. And obviously many other, Abe in Japan is probably the most powerful Japanese prime minister since the war. Mm-hmm. Modi in India is a different kind of leader. This seems to be, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in North America. I think Donald Trump, obviously, for many of the people who support him, is someone like that. And so the move toward a kind of a personalistic politics clashes at a number of deep levels with the sort of institutional and procedural values that we think of as being, the essence, in a sense, of liberal society.
It coheres with the diagnosis made a long time ago at the end, after the First World War, by the German sociologist Max Weber, who was very pessimistic about the ability of long-term survival of a liberal democratic consensus and the attraction of a charismatic leader. But that charisma seems to me connected to another factor which I think is very significant. If you look, let's say, at Hungary, a small place, relatively small place, there is a kind of a very aggressive belief in what we would call, what Orban himself called, illiberal democracy. That is to say, people wanting to shield themselves against two very stark realities. One is migration. Mm-hmm. And with migration, a kind of confrontation with their imagined identity of themselves as homogeneous. So there is a kind of fear of a kind of the end of the Roman Empire, kind of masses of people migrating who have no historical connection with what they think their patrimony is, and in addition, in nations that have a demographic decline. Russia has a demographic decline, all of Europe is experiencing a demographic decline, and so they need people. And the Syrian migration, for example, to Germany is of an enormous economic benefit to them. But there is this fear, and there's a belief that this strong personality you're talking about is going to protect their heritage, their culture, their identity as a kind of membership in a sacred group, and a kind of reductive nationalism that is somehow some kind of saving grace against deep dissatisfaction with their own lives. I can't quite figure out why it's so popular. People don't want freedom. They don't want, they think that's a kind of an opportunity to which they really don't have access, and it's kind of a trap. There's something hollow about it, especially after the fall of communism. Before '89, it was easy. You know, we were better than the other guys. The other guys were totalitarian. They were against freedom. So we looked good by comparison. With them gone, we didn't turn out to look so, positive.